She left her apartment just after dawn. No purse. No phone. Just a small plastic bag, and a purpose she'd carried for years. She moved slow, careful, harmless. But behind one of those windows, someone was watching. And in their mind, something wasn't right. They didn't call for help. They didn't open the door. They picked up a weapon. What happened next lasted seconds. The impact, permanent. One woman never made it home. The other says she was trying to survive. But what exactly was she surviving? And why was she wearing body armor inside her own apartment? In South Houston, police call it a tragedy. But others aren't so sure. Was it fear? Paranoia? Or something no one's willing to admit? This is a story without easy answers. And it all starts with a window and a silence that shattered everything. She said she feared for her life. Then, the other woman was unarmed. One woman died. The other says she was defending herself. But was there ever a threat? What investigators discovered on the footage would not only contradict her story, it would upend it. They called it a quiet neighborhood. A place where no one asked questions, because nothing ever gave them a reason to. But on a warm July morning, the quiet cracked. Not from a scream. Not from a siren. From something much sharper. It began in the shadows of a South Houston apartment block. A maze of windows, stairwells, and stories no one was ever supposed to hear. Some say she was just another tenant. Others say she didn't belong there at all. Some say she was helping herself. Others say she was helping everyone else survive. The only thing they all agree on is that she didn't deserve to die. She was 75 years old, known to carry bags filled with crushed soda cans, always walking, always alone, and always on her own kind of mission. She had no weapon, no threats, just the sound of rustling plastic and soft footsteps on concrete. What made someone point a gun at her is a question police are still trying to answer. But the more they investigate, the stranger it all becomes. Because when officers arrived, it wasn't just what they found at the scene, it was how they found it. The shooter didn't flee. She didn't hide. She stood waiting, calm, prepared, and armored. A bulletproof vest, a .223 caliber rifle, and a story that no one, not even the officers, were prepared to hear. She told them she feared for her life. She told them she believed she was under threat. But the person she claimed to fear was already lying still in the street. And the more detectives listened, the more one thing became clear. This wasn't just about fear. It was about perception, paranoia, and a mind unraveling behind closed blinds. This is a story of silence and suspicion. Of an elderly woman whose final steps were misunderstood, or something far worse. A case wrapped in layers of trauma, mental illness, and a deadly misreading of reality, if that's what it was. And it all begins here. With the woman they called Linda. Before the headlines, before the tape, before the shock and the sirens, there was just Linda. She wasn't famous. She didn't chase attention. She lived in the margins, quietly, gently, like so many others who go unseen until it's too late. She was 75 years old. By most accounts, she lived alone. But she was rarely still. Residents at the apartment complex say they saw her most mornings. Walking, bending, picking up cans. Some thought she was collecting them to help the environment. Others believed she was saving up change just to make it through the week. No one asked, and Linda didn't explain. She had her route, a quiet loop around the courtyard, the soft clink of aluminum trailing behind her. A rhythm, a ritual, one that gave her days shape, and maybe gave her life purpose. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't loud. She never knocked on doors or asked for anything. Just plastic bags, sunlight, and the ground beneath her feet. Neighbors say she spoke softly, smiled often, and never stayed in one place too long. Some say she had children. Others aren't sure. There are gaps in her story, pieces only she could have filled. But what's certain is this: she was harmless, familiar, a part of that neighborhood's morning rhythm. Until the rhythm was broken. When the story broke, her name came last. The shooter, the weapon, the motive, those were the headlines. But Linda was the loss. A woman erased in seconds, misunderstood in life, and nearly forgotten in death. But not here. Here we remember her not as a symbol, not as a question mark, but as a woman who deserved to finish her walk and return home. She didn't ask for anything that morning. She didn't knock. She didn't shout. She didn't break in. She walked past a window and never walked again. She walked quietly through the world, until the world made her a target. Before the bullet, before the vest, before the police asked their first question, she was just another resident. Unit 2B, second floor. The curtains stayed drawn. She rarely spoke to neighbors. She didn't linger in hallways. No visitors. No movement. Just the sense that someone was always inside, watching. Her name is Amber McNulty. She is 43 years old. Not long ago, her name meant nothing to anyone outside this building. A quiet name behind a closed door. But everything changes when silence gives way to sound. What little we know about Amber begins in pieces, fragments from public records, court filings, and the people who lived closest to her, but barely knew her at all. She moved into the apartment roughly 9 months before the shooting. She paid rent on time. She kept to herself. And for months, no one asked questions. But there were signs. Small ones easy to dismiss, until it was too late. One neighbor says she always had curtains closed, even in the middle of the day. Another said she seemed startled by sudden sounds, mail dropping through the slot, a knock on the door. There were no parties, no pets, no music, just the sense of a presence, there but unreachable. But the signs weren't just behavioral, they were clinical. Court documents would later reveal a tangled past, prior convictions, mental health evaluations, treatment orders, and something deeper. There were references to paranoia, patterns of isolation, diagnoses that lingered without consistency. One report used the word psychosis. Another referenced delusions. But none of it led to ongoing care. She slipped through the cracks. Or maybe, like so many, she found ways to survive in spite of them. What we do know is this: Amber McNulty was not supposed to have a gun. She was a convicted felon, prohibited by law from owning firearms. Yet on July 15th, she didn't just have one. She had a .223 caliber rifle. And she was wearing a ballistic vest. It wasn't found afterward. She was wearing it when officers arrived. That image lingers. A woman alone in her apartment, wearing body armor, rifle still warm. To the responding officers, she didn't look afraid. She looked ready. Amber told them she felt threatened. She told them she believed someone was trying to get inside. She described the figure outside her window as suspicious, a danger she couldn't explain, only feel. But what she described was Linda Edwards, 75 years old. No weapon, no voice raised, just a woman walking beneath a window. In Amber's mind, it was a threat. To everyone else, it was a misunderstanding, the kind that costs everything when left unchecked. When officers questioned her, she spoke clearly, without panic, without remorse, like someone who believed what she had done was necessary. But if she truly believed she was under siege, who did she think was attacking her? If she thought she was being targeted, why wasn't there a single call to 911? Why armor? Why aim? Why fire? Some will say she was sick, that she didn't know what was real. Others will say she knew exactly what she was doing and prepared for it. Neither theory brings Linda back, and both leave one truth lingering in the hallway of that apartment complex. Whatever Amber McNulty was seeing, it wasn't Linda Edwards. So the question remains, what did she see, and why did it end in gunfire? She said she felt afraid. But fear alone does not explain what happened next. It was still early, the kind of early where the sky hasn't made up its mind, somewhere between violet and steel gray. The streets of South Houston lay hushed, like they were holding their breath. At the Oakmore Apartments off Selinsky Road, the world was just beginning to stir. A few porch lights still flickered against the fading night. Someone's window box was dripping from overnight rain. Somewhere, a television murmured behind drawn curtains. And in the courtyard, a familiar sight, 75-year-old Linda Edwards. Neighbors say she walked that route almost every day. Slow, careful steps. A plastic bag in one hand, a small picker stick in the other. She'd collect recyclables, greeting those who passed with a soft, "Good morning." Not just a routine, it was her rhythm, her presence. Her way of being seen without making noise. At 7:05 a.m., she entered the breezeway, a narrow walkway between two buildings. She bent to pick up an empty can near the stairwell. She stood upright again. Nothing seemed different. But upstairs, inside apartment 215, 28-year-old Kaylin Lopez was watching. Or maybe listening. We don't know how long she had been near the window. We don't know if she'd slept at all the night before. What we do know is what came next. A sound breaks the silence. Some neighbors later describe it as a yell. Others say they only heard the sudden thunder of something sharp, a single shot. The echo bounced down the hallway. One woman peeked out of her door and saw Linda's body on the concrete. A call to 911 is placed at 7:07 a.m. The dispatcher notes panic, confusion. "There's an older woman on the ground," the caller says. "I think she's been shot." Less than 4 minutes later, the first patrol car arrives. Officers move quickly but carefully. One of them covers Linda's body with a blanket. Another begins canvassing the residence. Inside apartment 215, Kaylin Lopez doesn't run. She waits. The door is ajar. Her voice is calm when she speaks to the officers. She tells them what she believes, that she was in danger, that she had no choice. But outside, word spreads fast. Residents gather in disbelief. Some cry. Others whisper questions about what could have caused something so sudden and so final. By 7:30 a.m., the apartment complex is swarming with flashing lights, yellow tape, and the murmurs of witnesses trying to piece together what just happened. It would take hours before the scene was fully cleared. Days before charges were formally filed. And months before the community would hear the full version of what Kaylin said led her to pull that trigger. But in that moment, that short, sharp instant between stillness and tragedy, everything changed. A morning ritual became a final walk. It didn't take long for the headlines to catch up to the tragedy. But before the cameras arrived and speculation ran wild, there was silence. The kind that fills the air just after a life has been taken, and just before the story gets told. And on the morning of June 28, 2024, Kaylin Castillo was ready to tell hers. She sat in a small, gray-walled room inside Houston Police Department headquarters. The window behind her was fogged with humidity. A bottle of water untouched on the metal table. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. If she was shaken, she wasn't showing it, not yet. To detectives, it was a routine procedure. But this wasn't going to be a routine interview. The first thing she said, "I was afraid." She claimed Linda Edwards had tried to break into her apartment, had reached through her window yelling, screaming. Kaylin said she felt threatened, cornered, overwhelmed. She said she gave a warning. Then another. Then the shot. But investigators had already been to the scene. And things weren't adding up. There were no signs of forced entry. No damage to the window frame. No defensive wounds. Linda's body was found outside, not inside. And there was something else. The position of the wound, the downward trajectory. When questioned about the weapon, Kaylin offered a calm explanation. She had it legally, she said. It was kept for protection. But why, detectives wondered, had she used it so quickly? Why hadn't she called 911 first? Or at least waited longer? There were pauses. Long ones. At times she seemed rehearsed. At other times, emotionally distant. Not cold, but calculated. Then came the part that made the detectives lean in. She said this wasn't the first time Linda had come by. That the older woman had a history of strange behavior. That she'd even come to her window before, always talking about recycling, always carrying cans. As if that explained the fear. To Kaylin, this was about more than a single morning. She painted a picture of a woman who crossed lines, who didn't respect boundaries, and a moment of panic that pushed her to act. But to detectives, it still didn't explain the shot. It didn't explain why Linda was unarmed, why she was found on the ground level, still holding cans, or why there was no evidence she ever touched the apartment window. The deeper they went, the more fractured the story became. But one thing was clear: Kaylin Castillo was not backing down. She insisted this was self-defense. And to her, that was the end of it. But in homicide investigations, the story rarely ends in the interrogation room. It was now up to forensics, witnesses, surveillance footage, and, eventually, a courtroom. The morning of June 28 left investigators with a single question echoing louder than the rest. Was Kaylin Castillo telling the truth? She claimed fear. She claimed self-defense. But the physical evidence, the cold, objective evidence, would soon speak for itself. The Houston Police Department's forensics team arrived at the scene shortly after sunrise. Their task was simple: follow the evidence. Let it tell the story the words could not. First, the trajectory. The bullet had entered through Linda Edwards' upper chest, angling downward. It was a subtle but crucial detail. Because if Kaylin had fired from inside her second-story apartment window, why had the shot traveled at such a steep descent? That trajectory suggested something unexpected: that the shooter may have been standing, not retreating. That this may not have been a rushed reaction, but a deliberate act. Then came the analysis of the window. For someone allegedly reaching inside, there were no smudges, no fingerprints, no broken screen, no sign that Linda had physically breached the boundary. In fact, the only prints on the window belonged to Kaylin herself. Investigators also combed through surveillance footage from neighboring units. One camera, placed on the corner of an adjacent apartment building, offered a partial but critical angle. At approximately 5:37 a.m., Linda Edwards is seen walking slowly past Kaylin's building. She's carrying a plastic bag and a small reusable grocery sack. She stops briefly under a window, Kaylin's window, and looks up. She does not yell. She does not attempt to climb. She does not reach. What happens next is not captured by video. But the audio tells a different kind of story. A faint voice, female, is heard saying, "Don't come closer." Pause. Then a single shot. That audio alone shattered the timeline Kaylin had presented. Linda never reached. She never touched. She was outside. And yet she was dead, one shot to the chest. The final blow to her self-defense claim came from an unlikely source: a Nest doorbell camera 3 buildings over. It didn't catch the shooting, but it did catch Kaylin's voice, moments after. She can be heard speaking almost to herself. "Come," muttering, "she shouldn't have come back." Forensic investigators took all of this, the trajectory, the prints, the surveillance clips, the ambient audio, and delivered one conclusion to prosecutors: Kaylin Castillo's version of events could not be supported by the evidence. And in a homicide investigation, when the physical truth contradicts the verbal one, the case changes. Kaylin was no longer just a witness. She was a suspect. When the news of Linda Edwards' death broke, it traveled fast. At first, the headlines were straightforward. A woman had been shot outside her daughter's apartment in Houston. The shooter, her daughter's girlfriend. But within hours, the narrative began to fracture, not because of new facts but because of what people saw, and what they brought with them. On one side, there were those who saw Kaylin Castillo, 24, white, middle-class, college-educated, as a young woman trying to protect herself. A survivor of alleged abuse. A woman pushed to the edge. On the other side, Linda Edwards, 41, black, working class, a single mother who had been raising her son while navigating a strained family dynamic, became a symbol. A reminder of how quickly black women can be vilified even in death. Online forums became battlegrounds. Social media filled with comments that weren't just about guilt or innocence, but about identity, about bias, about whose fear is believed, and whose presence is seen as a threat. Some commenters immediately invoked the Castle Doctrine, Texas self-defense law, suggesting Kaylin had every right to protect herself from what she described as a break-in. But others pushed back. They pointed out the trajectory of the bullet, the lack of physical evidence supporting any forced entry, and most importantly, Linda was unarmed. Then came the conversations about class, about how quickly resources had been mobilized for Kaylin's legal defense. GoFundMes, legal representation, even media appearances from friends who described her as sweet, gentle, and afraid. Meanwhile, Linda Edwards' family struggled quietly to cover funeral costs. They weren't being interviewed. They weren't being heard. The imbalance felt familiar. And to many watching, especially women of color, it felt personal. In community spaces across Houston, the case triggered broader conversations about domestic violence, about mental health, about interracial relationships, and how quickly narratives can shift depending on who's telling the story. Local activists called for patience, but also for clarity, for justice wherever the facts led. But they also asked one thing of the public: to hold space for the victim, Linda, and not let her be reduced to a headline or worse, an obstacle in someone else's story of survival. Because beyond the courtroom battles and forensic reports, one fact remained: a woman had died in the early morning hours. And her name deserved to be spoken with care. The public reaction didn't just mirror the case, it magnified it. It showed that justice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in the stories we tell and the ones we choose to believe. The days following the tragic shooting of 75-year-old Linda Edwards were filled with unanswered questions and mounting frustration. In the tight-knit community of South Houston, people gathered near the apartment complex where it happened, leaving behind flowers, candles, and the occasional aluminum can. A quiet, painful tribute to a woman who was simply collecting recyclables to make ends meet, a task she had done for years. Inside a Harris County courtroom, the focus shifted. Attention turned not to a full murder trial, at least not yet, but to something narrower, more procedural: a single charge. Amber McNulty, 43, was formally charged with being a felon in possession of a firearm. According to court records, she allegedly used a .223 caliber rifle to fire a shot through her own apartment window. That single bullet struck Linda Edwards in the torso, ultimately ending her life. The legal weight of that moment, however, has yet to fully take shape. Despite the deadly outcome, no homicide charges have been filed as of now. Prosecutors have made it clear the investigation is still active. Additional charges, they say, are very much on the table. The delay has left many wondering, why the hesitation? Legal experts point to two key elements that may be at play: McNulty's mental health history and her immediate claim of self-defense. She reportedly told authorities she feared for her life, though Linda Edwards was unarmed and standing outside. Moreover, McNulty was wearing a ballistic vest at the time, an unsettling detail that adds to the gravity of the case. Her criminal history only deepens the complexity. Court documents show prior convictions for aggravated assault, past erratic behavior, and a documented history of psychosis. Some argue that these factors may be contributing to the cautious pace of prosecutors, who are likely weighing competency evaluations, psychiatric records, and forensics before pursuing more severe charges. In the meantime, McNulty remains the sole suspect and is being held on a $75,000 bond. The charge of felon in possession of a firearm carries significant weight on its own, but it does not yet account for the irreversible loss of life. For Linda's family, that's the hardest part to accept. There has been no formal acknowledgement, in court or otherwise, that her death was unjustified, no charge bearing the name murder or manslaughter. Not yet. The community continues to wait, not just for justice but for clarity. For a sense that the system sees Linda Edwards not as a footnote to someone else's crisis, but as a person who mattered. As of today, the words "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder" remain speculative. But that possibility still lingers, hovering in legal limbo, tethered to the evidence, the forensics, and the decision of a prosecutor who must now weigh not just the facts, but the meaning of justice itself. In the end, it wasn't a high-speed chase. It wasn't a dramatic standoff. It was a quiet moment, a woman collecting cans and another watching her through a rifle scope. One decision changed everything. But this story isn't over. Not really. Because justice doesn't end with an arrest. And it doesn't begin with a headline. It begins with awareness. If you believe Linda Edwards' story should be remembered, share this video. Let her name echo louder than the noise of speculation and silence. Comment below. Do you think justice has truly been served? Or are there deeper questions still unanswered? And if you want to be part of telling these stories the right way, with care, truth, and dignity, subscribe to this channel. We don't just follow the headlines, we follow the humanity behind them. Because every case matters. And so does your voice.